Hello and welcome to the seventh video interview, which is part of the series ECMI Conversations with Experts. For each episode, we invite a prominent expert in the field of minority studies to discuss a specific topic with one of the ECMI researchers. My name is Sergiusz Bober. I am a senior researcher at the European Center for Minority Issues in Flensburg, Germany, and I'm delighted that today I can talk to Garbi Schmidt from Roskilde University about the history of diversity in Denmark. Welcome, Garbi. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Before we begin, I should say a few words about Garbi. And it is important to say that in Roskilde, at the University of Roskilde, Garbi is professor of cultural encounters. In her research, she has focused on a range of minority-related topics, such as Muslim minorities in Western countries, immigration and minority history in Denmark, hyphenated identities. She's also, it is important to stress, a member of the ECMI Executive Board. And today, we would like to address the topic of diversity in Denmark, as it was already signaled, through the prism of Garbi's recently published book with the title "The First Ghetto." The book is a part of a series titled 100 Histories of Denmark. The series is published by Aarhus University Press. And the idea of the series is to present across 100 topics from the broadly understood history of Denmark, different aspects of that country's political life, social life, economic life, and so on. Since the book, as you can see on the screen, is published in Danish, and because of this, it is less accessible to the broader audience, as there are not that many Danish speakers in the world. We decided with Garbi that perhaps it's a good idea to discuss the book with her, and in that sense, make it slightly more accessible for the international audience who will not be able to enjoy it through Danish. And I think that we are done with the introductory part, and we should proceed to the interview itself, Garbi. And I think that since, as I mentioned, the idea of a series is to present a very multifaceted, dynamic also picture of the history of Denmark, perhaps we should begin with the historical roots of diversity in Denmark. So when the story begins, who are the first communities through which Danes got exposed to diversity, other religions, other ways of life, other foods, and so on?
I mean, basically, I would say if you took the sort of the long history of diversity in Denmark or Danish exposure to diversity, I mean, you could go as far back as human beings have been living in Denmark. I mean, when you're posing that question, I'm, for example, thinking about some of the really nice exhibitions in some of the Danish historical museums that are on at the moment that, show the encounter between Vikings and, both communities across Europe, but also the Middle East and farther away. So, I mean, diversity is, of course, as we all know, I mean, it's a part of human life.
Yes.
People move. People move across borders. People move within borders, but we move for various reasons. And sometimes diversity is the result of people, visiting other shores, and sometimes diversity, for various reasons, end up in, the location where people live. And when you're looking at Denmark, I mentioned the Vikings, but Danes have been seafarers, and Denmark has also been sort of the center of an empire. We had colonies, nothing compared to, for example, the UK or France or other larger nations, but just that, coming to visiting Copenhagen in the 1700s, you would have heard multiple languages being spoken. I mean, one thing is the empire, but we're also close to both Germany and to Sweden and to Norway, and there's always been a lot of interaction going on. So I think it's around 20% of the people living in Copenhagen in the early 1700s who had German as the mother tongue. So diversity is there. Yes. Yeah. It's of course, it's always the question. The question is always how diversity is handled.
Yeah.
According to what parameters. It's also a question, what types of diversity do you see, and what are you blind to?
Yeah.
Because basically we are all diverse. And so there's a diversity going on everywhere, but there are certain aspects of diversity that are ascendant and create pointed to as major points of both difference, and sometimes also problems.
Yeah.
Problematized.
Yeah, and I think this is a good pretext to ask about the changes concerning the 20th century, because the migration-related processes got a lot more intense from late 19th century towards the early 20th, and I think that this is the reality. This is the beginning of the reality that we are familiar with until basically our time. So, if you could say a bit about this, what changes in the 20th century? Are there any particular immigration waves that Denmark received? Are there any particular places where migrant communities live and in that sense affect the city landscape, for example?
I mean, as you told in the beginning, my book has the title, or carries the title, The First Ghetto. Yes. And there is a reason for that. And I would say, yes, that book has been written in Danish, to a Danish/Scandinavian audience, whoever understands our peculiar language. But I also have, articles and book chapters coming up that in English that focus on this particular topic. But in terms of enclaves or ghettos, as people, for example, started calling a district or some streets in the inner city of Copenhagen in the early 20th century. I mean, that points to, a certain group of refugees, and they were refugees, many of them. Some also came as working migrants. But what you see in the early 20th century is an influx of people coming from what is now known as the Baltic countries, Poland and Russia. And some of them came as refugees, as I said, because they had a Jewish background. And there's persecution of Jews was going on in those areas. It's the same historical period where you also see Eastern European Jews fleeing to London, to the UK, to Manhattan, and also in those areas, not least when it comes to the US, to Manhattan, there was talking about a ghetto. And of course that pointed back in history to understandings of the ghetto as a part of Jewish history in Europe. Many of us are familiar with the establishment of the ghetto in Venice in the 1500s. So there was, and then several ghettos both across Europe, but also Eastern Europe. And some of these ghettos we could say were voluntary, but many were not, and some were a mix. But so there was this idea about Jewish enclaves as being ghettos. That was a way of framing it, yes. Not least by the press, who said, well, okay, and also, of course, framing foreigners. Yes, you had these foreigners coming who all of a sudden, turned up in Copenhagen, spoke a different language that most Danes did not understand, and who also had a foreign religion. Well, it wasn't foreign because, of course, you also had Jews living in Denmark, but many of them had been assimilated at that point. And then besides that, I think it's important because, again, we are talking about diversity here, and it would be easy just to focus on religion and migration, refugees as aspects of this. But what's also really striking when you're looking at the sources from that period of time is that there was a widespread fear of socialism and revolutionary tendencies in Eastern Europe. And of course, you had people who also fled the Russia exactly because they had, for example, participated in demonstrations and so on and so forth. Yes.
Yeah.
But in Denmark, there was a widespread fear that these newcomers, it wasn't a religion, that was problematic or looked upon as problematic. It was the revolutionary tendencies that at least some of them brought with them.
So basically the fear of political instability.
Yes, and you can see that all over. I mean, that the more that I dig into this, the more it stands out as something that people, were concerned about.
Mm-hmm.
What were these people going to do to our society? I mean, one thing was that they were poor. Many of them were extremely poor when they ended up in Denmark. But then again, what kind of ideas were they bringing with them that could do things to Danish society in a negative sense?
So we can see that at least since the beginning of the 20th century, we have this sort of social fear. Perhaps we may even use the concept of moral panic related to immigration and diversity. The fear of the risks concerning the political stability of the country, economic stability, I guess. So the question now would be, since of course you mentioned the word ghetto so many times, how this concept was used around the time in the Danish press. Was this concept used at all? What were the ways of trying to deal with the danger that was coming from the outside to Denmark?
I mean, my starting point for writing this book was actually in Denmark. We have currently a legislation against or targeting certain urban areas that also, in terms of law, in terms of regulations, are framed as being ghettos. And I was curious about finding out, exploring, understanding, how the concept of the ghetto, the role that concept had played in Danish history in a longer historical perspective. That's very much how I work. I do focus on the present, what is a part of the current Danish debate about migration and immigration, but also to try to understand the current situation via a focus on history. So I actually went back to the 1850s and looked upon, how the ghetto was framed in Danish newspapers. And I would say for the first 50 years until 1907, the ghetto was an exterior. That was something that existed elsewhere in Europe, be it in Venice or Prague or also parts of Russia. But what happens in 1907 is that Danish newspapers start discussing or pointing to the existence of a ghetto in central Copenhagen. Yes. So there the ghetto changes from being something that, exists elsewhere to something that exists within Copenhagen, within national borders. What is also interesting when you're working on with the concept of the ghetto is that there are certain aspects or understandings that keep on sticking to the word. Yes, there was a reason why the press chose to talk about or write about, this area in Copenhagen as being a ghetto. That was, as I was saying before, many of the people who came there and settled down there were Eastern European Jews. But there was also, the neighborhood was also already known as characterized by crime. It was a slum area, yes, immense poverty. And those are also aspects that keep on clinging to the concept of the ghetto. It might be a consensual understanding of what the ghetto is, but it's still important to understand the weight of that word. And then a final thing, you were talking about moral panic. Now we could say that, but moral definitely plays a role here. In the sense of, for example, we also had some newspapers who wrote, well, these newcomers, we should be careful that, not too many are let into Denmark. We are hospitable people and country, but these persons coming from, from Russia, they are at a different moral level than us, which did not mean they were above, but definitely below, yes. So there was this thing about public moral that these newcomers were seen as a challenge to.
Yeah. So in this context, maybe we could say a few words about the very important debate that took place actually before the beginning of the 20th century, but very much speaks to this idea of immigrants as being really foreign and not like us. And also the issue of the ghetto perceived as a, can one say, topographical reality with certain boundaries. And you can, of course, leave the ghetto. Physically, probably it's relatively easy, but whether it's mentally easy, it's another question. And in this context, I would like to ask you, Garbi, to say a couple of words about a very important debate that was preceding the turn of the 20th century, but at the same time still concerned the Jewish migrants who came to Denmark. And then, of course, through this, I'm referring to the famous series of exchanges between Mayor Aaron Goldschmidt and Nikolai Grundtvig. So two very important intellectual personalities in the history of Denmark. And in this context, how this issue of being in the ghetto and then having the possibility of leaving the ghetto, how those issues were framed in this debate, because I suppose they very much influenced the discussions that took place several decades later.
I use that discussion as a starting point for discussing the concept of the ghetto in relation to the concept of Danishness. Because as you're saying, ghettos are all about borders. Can you escape the ghetto? Can you get out of the ghetto? Yes, in certain instances, yes, you can move out physically, but the ghetto is also a stigma that points to foreignness, that points to borders. And in that particular chapter where I dwell on this discussion between Goldschmidt and Grundtvig, I really go into the discussion about, first of all, Danishness, but also how the ghetto, the role that the ghetto has played in Danish cultural production. So one thing is, one agent here, important person here is Mayor Aaron Goldschmidt. More recently, it is, for example, Yahya Hassan, famous Danish poet who unfortunately died really young, but also rap music. So there's also something here about global tendencies and cultural production and so on and so forth. The concept of the ghetto is not used in the debate between Goldschmidt and Grundtvig. I want to stress that. Goldschmidt had a Jewish background. His great-grandfather, I think, great-great-grandfather, migrated from Hamburg and was Jewish. He was raised in a Jewish family in Vordingborg, the southern part of Denmark. He was an absolutely astonishing, writer, and his use of Danish language was exquisite. He also wrote about the ghetto, and not in Copenhagen or in Scandinavia, but actually in Rome.
Yeah.
What's really interesting there is pointing to the ghetto again as well. The walls between the ghetto and the rest of the city. I mean, that wall, physical wall, is perhaps not there, but the wall, I mean, it's now an invisible wall.
Yeah.
And when you're looking at his, his work as a writer, he has, I mean, you were also talking about hybrid identity. So his works, not least his novel, Adieu, points to this thing about, how do you handle having a hyphenated identity in the mid 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
But there is this debate between Grundtvig and Goldschmidt, and it starts out. I mean, both of them are well-known intellectuals. Each of them have their own journal, but Goldschmidt starts in an article asking sort of Grundtvig, what does it take for someone like me to become Danish? What happens to those of us who, have black hair, have strange surnames? What, can we still be a part of this country? And Grundtvig is not answering right away, but when he answers, he answers, with vigor and fury, saying, well, okay, yes, Goldschmidt, you might be excellent in writing Danish. You might be an excellent writer, and but still, you belong to the Jewish people, and therefore you are a guest in Denmark. You can be nothing but a guest. You do not belong to this people because you belong to another. Yes, you can only belong to one people. That was his way of
Yes.
sorry, I wouldn't say handling hyphenated identity, but definitely saying that could not exist.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the debate of also historically of the ghetto, there is still, I mean, there is this thing about, where borders, visible or invisible, walls, visible or invisible, where they are put and how people handle them.
Yeah. Well, I very much think that the discussions between Grundtvig and Goldschmidt are sometimes so similar to the polemics you can see in today's press. If you take a few newspapers from the stand at the newsagents, you can find similar arguments actually about literally a ghetto belonging, not belonging, hyphenated identity, the possibility of having hyphenated identity, or the impossibility actually of having such an identity profile. But I think that it's perhaps a good moment to link all this to the developments taking place in the second half of the 20th century. And of course, already we've made a few references to this newer aspects of the diversity in Denmark. We've mentioned Yahya Hassan, but of course we mentioned rap music as well as a channel of expressing topics and discussing topics similar to those covered by Grundtvig and Goldschmidt. But if you could say a few words about this, because I think that in your book, and it's in a way it's a tiny volume, but it's so rich. There is this phenomenal layer of ethnographic impressions, if I can put it this way. So you discuss the way we eat, but also the way we smell certain things, the way we hear certain things. So what changes in the landscape, in the Danish landscape, if I could put it this way, in the second half of the 20th century in terms of diversity? And of course, this is very much linked to the issue of this revival of the concept of ghetto, but this we can accept later. So what changes in Denmark in, let's say, the more recent decades?
A lot of things change, and I hope we also have time, just a couple of minutes at one point, to go all the way back, because what I also point out in my book is, basically I start, around 1500s.
Yeah.
And also one of the things is, many would say that the ghetto in one way or another is an ethnic enclave. and ethnic enclaves have existed in Denmark for a very long time. You know, in the 1500s, you had people coming from Holland, from the Dutch territories, moving to Denmark, being invited by the king. Some of you might know Christiansfeld, very close to the Danish-German border, that were established by German Herrnhuter, who were also invited by the king in 1700, late 1700s. Yes. I mean, the thing is that the concept of the ghetto travels. As I was saying, there's certain things that stick to the word, but there are also things that changes. So if you move up to, for example, just post World War II, of course, the ghetto was then associated with the atrocities that took place in Europe during and also before Second World War. Yes, that was associated with the Holocaust for very good reason. But a part of that the development or the understanding of the word, one thing is what happened in Europe, but you also had at that point in time, and also going back to the 1920s or even before that, discussions of ghettos as being established in the US, either by Jews but also the Negro ghetto. Think about the Chicago School.
Yeah.
There was a discussion of the ghetto there. They were talking about the Negro ghetto, yes. And what you see in, for example, the 1960s, early 1960s, where the guest workers hadn't come yet, was that the ghetto concept was used about social housing quarters of cities. Yes, that was again a question of class. Social class is also an aspect of this. What happens in the late 1960s is that again the ghetto starts getting associated to people coming from outside of Denmark with the guest workers, not necessarily as something negative. Yeah. Wouldn't it just be nice and good for their assimilation into Danish society that they were living together? Yes.
Yeah.
So there, the ghetto actually became a somewhat positive thing, at least to some. You also, at a later point in time, hear somebody talking about a designer ghetto. Yes. Of course, you also have the concept of the millionaire ghetto,
Yeah.
which also points to the class perspective. What happens then in the early 1980s is that we have this shift from a focus on guest workers and immigrants as being guest workers to immigrants as being Muslims. And there's a renaissance of the religious aspects of the ghetto, where the ghetto changes from being something that characterizes or is inhabited by a Jewish minority to an area that is inhabited by a Muslim minority. Yes.
Yeah.
And that's where we are now. So I would say if we're looking at the Danish landscape now and how, both legislation is framed but the entire discussion, again, it has to do with social class, it has to do with migration, it has to do with crime, educational level, and then it definitely also has to do with religion.
So when mentioning those aspects and legislation, you probably refer to the big change of 2018 when the word ghetto was all over the Danish media, all over the discourse in Denmark concerning the political project of basically getting rid of the ghettos, right?
I mean, that started earlier than that. Yes, I mean, you have ghetto plans from the early 2000s. Yes. They have come at at a certain pace over the last 20 years, and also going back to the 1980s and 90s, there is a discussion. You have committees that governmental committees that are working on this question about the deterioration of certain housing, social housing areas in Denmark and what to do about it. There is a discussion of, certain mayors in Denmark who say now we have too many immigrants living in these areas, in our municipality. We got to do something. So the discussion is there, but it's 1980s and 90s, at least on the national level, people are really careful about, using the word the ghetto. And they are also careful about using the word ghetto in relation to migration. Yes.
Yeah.
Where if, for example, I'm just paraphrasing, in one of the reports, somebody writes, it's not the deterioration of these areas is not a result of migration. Yes, it's all due to social class. But when you look at the early 2000s and then onwards, the ball changes. That's I mean, the ghetto is also, in terms of legislation and action plans, really linked to the question of migration. It's one of the criteria for saying, well, this is a ghetto, or what it's called now perilous society, that a certain proportion of inhabitants in that particular area have come from non-Western countries, or have family with parents that come from that.
Yeah, and returning to the most recent development, so 2018. So what's the aim of this rather comprehensive legislative project concerning the ghettos? What's the aim of the Danish state in relation to the areas identified by the state itself as ghetto areas? What's the aspiration of the authorities?
But the aspiration is, for one thing, a way of securing the Danish welfare state, I would say, but also a way of securing social cohesion. And those are main arguments. Yes. It's a way of ensuring, and now I'm using official arguments. It's a way of securing the integration of people from non-Western countries, where this thing about living in some type of enclave is seen as a slowing down integration and eventually hindering it from taking place. And I think it's also this thing about, we were talking about ghettos, but also me pointing to the concept of parallel society, because when that concept is implemented, I think it really tells you something about, that these areas are seen as countering social cohesion. Yes. Yeah. And eventually,
Yeah. Well, I'm looking
but again, I would also say there's a lot of resistance within these areas. Also because what happens is that, was talking about, the ghetto is always associated with some kind of stigma. That also happens here. Yes. And there's this thing about, there are definitely problems in these areas, but it's also people's home.
Yeah.
It's where people live. Yes. It's where their children go to school. But this thing about, having your home so heavily regulated and turned into, I would say, a space of exception in a very negative sense, is something that people are upset about. Yes.
Yeah.
Because it's this thing about being looked upon as a less good person, as a less valid citizen, because you live in one of those areas, and also having, I would say, less independence in terms of what you can do and what you can't do.
Yeah.
What is happening now is that, you know, housing blocks are being torn down in these areas, which means that, you know, some people are losing their homes and they cannot do anything about that.
Yeah. So I'm looking at, this is absolutely fascinating conversation, Garbi, but I'm looking at the watch and it doesn't make me comfortable at all. But I think that that means in practice that we should probably go towards the end. And anyway, we are touching upon the most recent developments. So in terms of the time span of your book, we kind of made the journey. But I also wonder, and perhaps this is going to be my final question. And here I would like to return to the debate between Grunfeld and Goldschmidt that we discussed before. Having all your historical, anthropological, sociological, and so on knowledge, where do you think the trend might go? Will we be closer to Goldschmidt in the next few decades, or rather closer to Grunfeld? What would be your hunch, if I can use this word?
You may, and it doesn't make it easier for me.
Yeah, it's futurology.
The thing is that not least when we're looking at the world right now and how things change and can, you know, just change from one day to another, or from 1 second to the next. I think this thing about, you know, looking into the crystal ball as a researcher, I have a problem with that. I would say that history for me is an important, you know, way to understand how we got to where we are now, but also to understand you know, the sort of kind of variety or diversity that are in responses to a certain, you know, situation. The ghetto is not one thing, it's many. It can, you know, according to a specific historical period, it might imply something that, you know, was absolutely different just 20 years earlier. So, but I think this thing about you referring to Goldschmidt and Grundtvig, at least we can say, you know, there are those options in terms of Danishness. There is this, you know, there can be the acceptance of hyphenated identity, referring to an acceptance that is probably, you know, not only how migrants live their lives, but basically all of us. And then there is the hardening of national borders. Again, both the physical borders, but also the invisible borders that point to aspects of identity and politics. And when we see what is happening in Ukraine right now, and sort of the geopolitical landscape of Europe as it looks at the moment, you can see both in terms of, for one thing, how refugees are received right now, for example, in Denmark, but also, of course, Europe. It's difficult to say what happens and what, you know, the situation will be 5, 6, 7 months from now. But you can definitely see, you know, the national borders and the perception of somebody as so much of an other that it's valid to kill them.
Yeah.
That is still out there.
Yeah. Well, so it's hard to be an optimist, I would say, but definitely in a few months and in a few years we might have a good reason to meet again and see what happens, and maybe address again certain of the issues discussed here today. Another look at the watch. And I think again that we're really running short of time. So Garbi, I can only thank you so much for this fascinating discussion, and I hope that our audience, our viewers, are enjoying this as much as I do. And as I said, I think it would be good at some point to return to those issues and see how the situation changes, in which direction certain social dynamics dynamics go. So for today, thank you very much, Garbi, for giving us this insight into the history and present day of diversity in Denmark. And to our viewers, I can only say that I'm very grateful for your attention. For more information on ECMI, please follow us on social media. Also, please visit our website. It's www.ecmi.de. And stay tuned for the next episode of our conversations with experts. And until then, goodbye. Thank you again, Garbi. Goodbye.
Thank you, and goodbye, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.